Political debate over housing is continuing as Labor fails to resolve its stalemate with the Greens over the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. But how is this issue translating with voters? Joining me now live is Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. So the Greens, they're certainly remaining defiant on this. Is this posturing of sorts popular with voters?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's certainly cutting through for voters at the moment, which is, I think, in itself interesting. In a context where there is this, we've been talking about this growing frustration with the Albanese government, sort of timidity, lack of boldness around economic reform. This debate around social housing and some of the other Greens ideas around rental freeze, these sorts of things are cutting through. Unfortunately, they're not cutting through, and I think the way the Greens would have liked them to be cutting through. So what we've seen, for example, in our polling is that the support for the social housing fund, even with its flaws, as the Greens would see it in terms of being relying on stock market returns and those sorts of things, more Greens voters, particularly Greens voters in those inner suburban seats, more Greens voters support the policy as it is than oppose it. So there's a sort of a disconnect happening there between the Green base and what they're talking about in the federal sphere. The other thing they've done is very successfully promote the idea, promote the issue. So we saw immediately after the budget that, cut through on the social housing fund was a bit mild, a bit meek and mild. It was patchy in some groups, you saw it, in other groups you didn't. It's now, as I say, coming up. It's coming up unprompted, and it's coming up because of this sort of debate around it the Greens have put on it, and it's not a debate that's really resonating with the voters of Australia. And particularly, if you look at those voters that the Greens would be hoping to pick up off the Labor poll in some of these inner suburban seats where they'd be hoping to gain seats at the next election, what we're seeing there is it's reminding them of exactly what they don't like about the Greens. It's reminding them, they use the word childish in focus groups when they talk about it. It's sort of seen as this kind of letting, perfection get in the way of something that would actually bring relief to people. And people talk about this disbelief that the Greens are blocking social housing. So yeah, absolutely, it's not playing out in the way in which I think they would hope.
No, and look, it's an interesting analysis as well, particularly in the middle of a cost of living crisis where people want answers very quickly. The Greens keep pushing or demanding a rental freeze. Is that at all cutting through?
This is a really interesting thing. So again, particularly with those sort of middle Australia voters that in those inner suburban areas that the Greens would need to pick up again off the Labor pile, they look at this policy and what they're saying is it's one piece of a story. It's one little snapshot. It's not enough on its own. So we're not sort of philosophically opposed to it. We want to do things to help renters, and a lot of them are renters themselves. But there is this sort of sense that, well, you can't just go freezing rents if the landlord's interest rates are going up at the same time. So we are sort of cognizant that there is these strains on everyone at the moment, and this is just one little piece in a bigger puzzle. If you then move out to sort of lower income communities, outer suburban communities, what you've got to understand there is the sort of the fear and the anxiety that exists amongst renters and those sorts of communities. So what we see there is folks sort of say, look, I'm really worried. If I lost my rental, I'm not sure that I'd get another one because the competition for them is so great. I'm not sure that I could afford the sort of the going rate. I've got something I can afford. I won't say it's reasonable, but something I can afford at the moment. And I'm really worried that if I lost my rental, that I don't know what I would do because of the competition. I just don't think I could pick up another one. And so they look at this policy and it makes them really nervous. So they're looking at it and they're going, well, again, if it's just this one-sided sort of thing, what happens if my landlord decides, look, that's enough and I'm just going to sell? Where do I go then? So it's not resonating in those middle suburban, middle sort of inner suburban seats. And it's not resonating very much with low-income renters in the outer suburbs who it just makes them nervous.
What about among younger voters, though? The rent caps, that argument from the Greens, surely that would be popular among many younger voters in particular.
Yeah, again, you sort of see this nuance. So absolutely, there are some younger voters that would waving the flag and very much supporting this and very much see it as targeted against landlords that are very much the enemy and those sorts of things. Yep, absolutely that exists. But even there still exists this kind of idea of, but this is not a housing policy. What just freezing rent caps isn't a long-term solution. It might actually make things worse in the short term, as I say, with sort of landlords deciding to exit the market and those sorts of things. So there is this desire for bold policy, which we've talked about numerous times on this program. But it needs to be policy with a bold vision. Whereas this is sort of just seen as very, very pointed, very insular, one trick pony sort of stuff. And as I say, focus on looking at it with a nuanced position going, this isn't enough. This isn't a housing policy. This doesn't solve the problems. At the very best, it might give me some temporary relief, but it could actually produce sort of short, medium-term problems.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt the policy's in limbo and now Parliament's on a break, so anything could happen. Simon Welsh, good to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.